welcome, welcome, welcome. You are here today in the Nature Journal Educators Forum Special Edition, where we have two special guests. I would like to introduce you Rebecca Rolnick and Kate Ryder, who are two of our regular participants, but are going to be really helping us think about the impact of storytelling in our education and journaling. We're also joined today by co-hosts Avea Moore. Avea, say hi to everybody.
Everybody, good to see you today.
And Billy Joe Reed.
Hey everyone, great to be here.
Good to have you all here. This is going to be, I think we're in for a very interesting discussion, and we're going to start to the big picture today. What we're going to be doing is thinking about story and the power of story in our journaling, in our thinking, and our educational practice. We're going to first start with a story by Rebecca Rolnick. So thank you so much for being with us. Maybe what we could do is, in case people don't know you, just Rebecca, we'll have you briefly introduce yourself, and Kate, have you briefly introduce yourself, and then we'll bounce right back to Rebecca.
Sure. Hi everybody. If we haven't met, I'm Rebecca. I'm from Syracuse, New York, otherwise known as the ancestor land of Onondaga Nation. And I teach the Writing Workshop Wednesdays events in the Nature Journal community. I'm a naturalist, writer, environmental educator, nature connection mentor. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here to talk about stories today.
I'm so glad that you could be part of this discussion. This is your jam. And Kate, thank you also for being with us today.
Aloha kako, o Kate Ryder, ko inoa no kailua mai au. My name is Kate Ryder. I'm from Kailua, Oahu in Hawaii. I am learning the Hawaiian language. I am a hula dancer, a cultural practitioner, and I am also an artist and an activist and a writer and an educator and mom and auntie, and still working on my introduction. So I'm really excited to be with you all, and yeah.
Yeah, and Kate, you were actually the reason that that this topic came up in one of our previous workshops. You dropped a bit of wisdom on us that had all our heads spinning, and we realized as towards the end of a other conversation that we needed to dive more deeply into that. So we're going to be revisiting those ideas and then expanding on it. But maybe to just kind of get this ball rolling, Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I thought it would make sense to start off today by telling you a story. So this is a true story. It happened in September last year, and this is based off one of my Nature Journal entries here. So this is called The Mysterious Lights. And I think Eve has heard this story. So it was after dark, and I went out into my backyard, and then I saw a dot of light on the ground, almost like a falling star. And that was very strange. So I stared at it for several seconds, and then it slowly faded away. And I'd seen this before recently too, but I didn't know what it was. Was it just a trick of the light, or a reflection from a dewdrop? And I had no idea what it could be. It almost seemed like it wasn't really there. Maybe I was just imagining. And it kind of reminded me of a firefly, but that didn't make sense because the fireflies were long gone from the light show that they have during the summer. They weren't around anymore, so it couldn't be a firefly. So I just stared at that spot and waited to see if it might come back. And eventually the light did come back. So I rushed to crouch down and investigate it more before it disappeared again. It was definitely real. It almost seemed like maybe it was some kind of tiny creature down in the leaves, but I couldn't tell what it was. So it was all tucked away in the leaves and the grasses. So I was reaching down kind of blindly because it was dark out and tried to pull it up. And finally I had this little teeny creature in my hands. And it looked like a larva with a little light on the bottom. So I was holding them in my hands. And so I sketched when I came back in, it looked like this. So I was wondering, is this a firefly larva? It's the offspring of the fireflies that were here during the summer. And I didn't think that the juveniles had any lights. So I was wondering, why have I never seen this before? And then I had a bunch more questions about it. But my biggest thing from this experience is that I've lived in the house I live in for about 15 years. And I've lived in this ecosystem for most of my life. And yet there was something that I never seen before, right in my backyard. And that was completely amazing. And so that just shows how much more there is to discover for all of us, all around us. So that's basically the story. This is from my nature journal entry. And the reason I want to start by sharing that is because, I could have, and this would have been totally valid. I could have just gone in my notebook and put down, like, I noticed, I wonder it reminds me of, jot down a list with some notes, made some scientific kind of observations. And that's all great as well. But the fact that I told it as a story, at least I hope, drew you all in a little bit more. And, when it's a story, we all listen a little bit more closely because we're wired to learn through story and to be entertained by them, but we're also invisibly, we're learning something at the same time. And the other thing about this being a story instead of just some observations is that now this story has a much deeper personal meaning for me in my life. And it's part of the many little teeny stories that make up my life story. And now it's something that I can also share with you. Because, as humans, we're all storytellers, all right? We all tell little stories every day, but when we know that we're doing it and we're conscious of it, it can be so powerful. And the other thing is that we actually prefer to hear stories that are similar to us. There's, when something new that we learn is connected to something that's already in our brain, it gets pulled in better. And so stories itself, the structure of stories, is something that's so ingrained to us that when something's in the structure of a story, it can that can be like a vehicle for learning new things. And, we especially love to hear stories that are familiar to us, or through the structure or through the retelling of familiar stories. And, we love to hear the same stories again and again. They become a part of us. So just for example, I know that a story Jack tells a lot is, or at least I've heard a few times now, is that the time that you went to the school where they weren't, they didn't think that the kids would do very well with your nature journal workshop, but then they did. And now when you start to tell this story, I'm like, ooh, I know what story this is. This is a good one. And I'm like, oh boy, I love this story. So we can tell some of the same stories that just become kind of like our personal or group mythology in that kind of way. And so it's and before, I don't want to hog all of the time, but I want to share, there's a quote in Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature. There's a quote from E.O. Wilson that says that natural history writers are storytellers. Scientists are storytellers. Scientists live and die by their ability to depart from the tribe, go out to an unknown terrain, and bring back some new discovery or new fact or theoretical insight and lay it in front of the tribe. And then they all gather and dance around it. Symposia are held in the National Academy of Sciences and prizes are given. There's fundamentally no difference from a Paleolithic campsite celebration. So this idea of we all go out into the world every day, we have experiences, and then we come back together and we share and we learn from each other. And what I'll talk about more later too is we can share information, but also when we share, we process the story, and then that helps us to understand it even better and to make it a part of ourselves. So that's what I wanted to start out with for today.
Rebecca, that's a brilliant introduction for this topic. You've really got me thinking now about the degree to which, as a scientist, I'm trained to almost discount the story of as the anecdote, right? But the anecdotes are incredibly powerful vehicles for, we can visualize out. I can see you out there in the, kind of with your hands going into the dark and not really knowing what's there. I can, that picture is so vivid that you're absolutely right. I'm predisposed to learn that way. But we're training scientists to tell your story with data, show the chart, give us the data, which, it is true. One of the things that scientists say is that, that some people say that anecdote is not evidence, which isn't strictly true. Anecdotes are evidence. They're just not a strong form of evidence in terms of persuasion, but they are very powerful in persuading people, right? So an anecdote is a sample size of one, right? And so it's easy to kind of think, if you're kind of putting on your science hat, to say, well, with a sample size of one, I'm not going to share that. There's no evidence there. But if that anecdote is then representative of the overall pattern that you're seeing, then it's incredibly powerful. So I want to give pushback about the idea that anecdotes are data, just as long as you're aware that the anecdote is a sample size of one, but also then to realize that when that is coupled with sort of seeing a larger pattern, we don't train scientists how to tell good stories. And we're all set up just to sit around the campfire and listen to the story. But we don't tell the good stories, or we're hesitant to tell good stories. This is really interesting. I would love to bring Kate in on this and see if Kate, if you have any, if listening to what Rebecca was saying, if you had any that sort of sparked any thoughts or ideas or extensions and other thoughts about that.
Yeah, it does. That's actually a perfect segue into kind of what I had been thinking about and kind of prepared, is that I was thinking about all the different types of story. And it's funny because I'm not a scientist, I'm not trained as a scientist. When I think about sharing scientific information, it's usually in the form of a story. So I think of my auntie taking out the glass bottom boat tours into Kaneohe Bay, and the way she introduces people to the scientific history of the bay is through a story, and it's the volcanic geological story. Okay, there was this big volcano, and you imagine it, exploding all over here, and then there's this giant, landslide, and that's what made these islands, is the land falling off and crashing, and then there was tidal waves, and and this was happening over millions of years, and then you have things coming in, and then the coral comes up, and so you get really excited. And I remember, because it was my auntie, so I got to go on the tour all the time for free. And so again, it was that excitement of just like, oh, she's going to tell this story, I know what it is. And every time you hear it, you like understand it in a different layer. But she was a storyteller, but it was this scientific information, and it was told in this like very engaging, exciting, and very immediate way, because you're right there, you're standing there, and you're looking at all these mountains, you're looking at all this evidence, but you're imagining just, all of these crazy events happening. And I always thought that was so wonderful. And I realize now that probably inspired me in my journey now, is growing up with that sort of experience, and then they would jump off the side of the boat, and they would dive down, and they would bring up the limu, the seaweed, and there would be all these little creatures inside, and you would, like search through and discover, but it was always within this scientific context and within a cultural context as well. And so, okay, so yeah, so you have like the scientific story, and you can tell the science story through data, but at some point when you're writing up a research report, it is going to be a story. You're going to say, here's where my methodologies, here's this, it's a very like concise, dry story, but you can take that story and you can find a way to tell it that is, exciting and engaging. I also think of like anthropological, and anthropology as like another sort of scientific story. And that one's told a lot, like when we talk about like the Native and Indigenous people here, it's saying, okay, we have found this evidence that, there was the Lolu population declined around 200 AD. And so we think that this is what happened. And this is when, the first, Hawaiians came and, came to this land and, started changing the plant makeup. And so I've heard some, anthropologists or archaeologists, one of those, maybe combination, I guess, people who like dig up core samples and then like use that evidence. But when they talk to different audiences, if you can tell it like a story, and you kind of can imagine, the migration of people, and, how the plants are growing and dying and living and changing, and, these are coming up and these are going down, and those sort of, massive changes happening in concert with the people. And then, which kind of brings me though into, and then you also have all these cultural stories, and those are definitely different ways of engaging people, because you have like your personal anecdotes, but you also kind of have these cultural stories that we all know. And there's, we've talked before about pop culture being a way to draw in people. Like you talk about like there's like Spies Like Us, or Spies, and where it's like the pigeon, and then you can talk about when you see the pigeons, you talk about the pop culture story. You talk about Harry Potter. I actually have it with me, I think right here. This is I got my daughter out and her friends out. We did the Magizoologist Guide to Plants and Animals. And so based off of the Harry Potter, like the Fantastic Beasts, there's this really wonderful book, and it's a very scientific book, but it's also tied in with the Harry Potter lore. And so they went out and they found like places and animals, and some of these are based off of like actual like plants that we saw. So these two were actually plants that we found in a botanical garden. And then on the back, they did like the classification levels. This was all on their own, by the way. Like this is not me like telling them to do this. And this is all imaginary, but like it's based in these same sort of ways of thinking, and it's tying in what they're seeing and experiencing with these cultural stories, and along with like a scientific story as well. And so they like made up stories about like what the animals do and where you can find them. Oh, this was my favorite. There's this really strange tree in the botanical garden we go to a lot where they have all these things hanging down and they imagine them as bee pods. So it's like a bee tree. So all these sort of things, you know, what is it? What's it like? Categorizing. So yeah, so they created that. I have the book. I will go find it when it is Rebecca's turn to talk again. And but yeah, I think but folklore was popular culture of an older time. You know, like all of my friends studies folk songs, and they're just like, it was what was popular at the time. Like it was these characters, and there was just a different way of telling them versus like music and TV and books and movies. It was just like the songs. And same thing with indigenous tales. It's interesting because a lot of times they're dismissed as anecdotes, when really a lot of them are this shared creation of, like, they're not, because it's, a lot of them are oral storytelling. They're told over and over and over again. And so all of these layers of information and experience get layered into it. And so this is what I got so excited about when I spoke last time, was there's this epic tale of Hi'iaka Ikapoliopele here, and she travels like the whole island chain. And it's easy to just say like, oh, it's just, you know, this Hawaiian story or whatever, but it has so much information that is really like just like layers of information about rain, about land, about ways of travel through these islands, and about like their stories. You know, there's a story of, you know, this certain sort of rock that you can find in this one waterfall, and how that rock came to be there. And it's because she battled the mo'o, the giant lizard, and, you know, knocked off a piece of its head, and that's how it landed there. But it talks about these, you know, huge about geological upheavals and big changes that happen to the land, and how people can interact with the land and create a safer place for people and for other beings to be in here, and how we alter the land and how we have a responsibility to the land. And it has layers of meaning about how, like, proper ways to greet people and have relationships with each other and relationships with the land, and the kuleana to the land, the responsibility that is a relationship. And so, you know, it's cool because I'm hearing more and more now of scientists looking seriously at indigenous stories and understanding that there are more layers there that, you know, might sound fantastical and wild, but they have this sort of information that can really inform us today and inform our choices moving forward. And something I was thinking about today too is that we have to be careful when we're telling those stories, you know, to not tell them out of context, to make sure that they're an appropriate story to be telling in that situation. You know, there are like sacred stories that you know, are meant to be shared in a very certain time or very certain place or very certain people. And you can find them on the internet now, you know, but that doesn't mean that we necessarily should be telling them to anybody who comes through in any sort of way or any sort of context. And there are other stories, you know, especially if you can hear them from a person with, you know, indigenous, like native ties to the land, are just, there's just so, the story I really want to share is, I think, of volunteering at one of the local restoration areas, and, you know, Uncle Kihei sitting down with the kids, and he's talking about the Pa'uo Hi'iaka and the tale of Pa'uo Hi'iaka, and this is this plant, and it grew to cover, you know, Hi'iaka when she was a baby, and it tells these layers of meaning of like how it grows very quickly in the sun, and it does cover up an area. So there is this like literal layer to it, but just that intimacy of him sharing that with the keiki and, you know, passing on that story. And as part of that story too, is there's the ohai is there, and it's the first one that tries to cover the baby, but doesn't grow as fast, which is true. It doesn't grow as fast, and it's not as like tightly woven. It's more open. But what's interesting is that when next time I went out to another native area, I did find that the Pa'uo Hi'iaka and the ohai grew together. And so it's so interesting that this story that is told that, you know, the ohai and the Pa'uo Hi'iaka are friends, they literally are friends. And so so that's that power of story is that. And so then when I talk to the keiki about, when I share, to the kids, I say, oh, these plants are friends, so whenever you see one, look for the other one. And that's just like, so it's like so immediate and so relatable, but it still has that, that evidential, like scientific sort of basis to it. And I think, not that it necessarily has to. I mean, some of these are just wonderful stories and talk about other layers of understanding and meaning and relationship, or, but it's so cool when you do see that happening. And then just like the one last thing I wanted to say before so I don't forget is just talking about what we spoke about in our writing workshop Wednesdays was there's also the personal story of like the anecdotal like experience of being out there, but then there's also like our internal personal story about like, why are we even here and what are we even doing out here? And so sharing all these different types of stories helps us understand our place in the world, but ultimately like we each have our own kind of identity story almost of just kind of like, this is who I am, I'm an artist, or I'm an educator, or I'm, a writer, or I'm a scientist, or those sort of things. And so really being conscious about those types of stories that the kids or their students are telling themselves, and then the story that, we're conveying to them, and the stories that we're telling ourselves. Like that's the biggest one that I'm working on, I know, is just trying to figure out like, who am I and what is my place in the world and what is my place here, in this land that's very much like still has a strong indigenous presence, and as this white person, and how do I like behave with responsibility in different places and with different people, and and that like I don't think I'm a very good artist, or I don't think I'm a very good writer, and what does that even mean, and all of those sort of different layers of things. But I think all of these stories kind of help me like quiet that and just, live inside it's something else, other than just my own head. So yeah.
There's just so much to unpack here. I hear you talking about traditional ecological knowledge, sort of, of observations made by traditional people of landscape and place that then get embedded into story that and scientists throughout Canada and United States and other places in the world are working with native storytellers to try to understand through story some of the lessons that are ingrained in them. I think your idea of sort of the idea of origin stories and like your personal origin story is beautiful. There is a story that we tell ourselves, and how can we form a narrative that helps us connect to the land and the landscape in a place that is meaningful. You have that wonderful example of this fictitious storybook of mythical magical beasts that those students created. Yet some of our stories can be fiction. Some of our stories can be nonfiction. And how it makes me wonder about like, how do we think differently when we are bringing, like with Rebecca's example of the little glowworm, not just looking at that from the perspective of, I found this, here's the body length, here's the duration of the time that I saw the glow, those sorts of things, but that narrative of the adventure of discovering it. There's some wonderful comments happening in the chat, and I'd love to bring them into this this conversation. Aisha, would you feel comfortable with me putting you on the spot to drop some of your thoughts and reflections on this? All right, here you can now unmute, and we're gonna bring you in. There you are. Oh, this is going to get interesting. Wait, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
It's because I haven't said anything.
Okay, there we go. So, hey, stuffy party here.
I am sharing what became my storytelling tools at my school. I was K-5 teacher, for those of you who don't know me, the environmental educator. And maybe you wanted me to talk about something else, Jack, but this is what started popping up into my mind, is they became my storytelling tools. And what was interesting was, it was a way for me to grow as an educator. I was getting really bored with what I was teaching and how I was teaching. And I was just ready to come another way and started telling stories based on real stuff. But then they started developing their own personalities, which was fascinating, which was independent of my planning it. And in fact, I discovered the magic. I started calling myself a storyteller, which was a whole new way to see myself. And I started talking to other people who were official storytellers, like Anne Carla Rivera and Marin and a few other people. And one of the things they said to me was, indeed, that's because I said, you know, I don't write out most of it. I have a very rough outline in my head of what are the scientific points I have to get across. But then I just start rolling. And it gets longer and longer, and they have all these pieces they start bringing in as they interact with each other. And I sometimes go home and write it down later, like that story fleshed itself out. And Anne Carla Rivera, who's also looked at a lot of indigenous storytelling, said, there is this belief that there is this net in the sky, or I mean, out there, of stories, and that we start drawing from them. And it's a process that we can't control. We just have to open ourselves up to it. And it just, because I was like, I said to her, I was like, these amazing things happen in my storytelling sessions. Where did they come from? And she said, there is this net that people tap into. So it was beautiful because it took it out of the day-to-day scientific way of looking at the world, and that there was some magical piece happening for me. And the other thing that was beautiful, because we were talking about indigenous stories, I realized that this is Koli short for colibri, and this is Maya. And Koli ended up being the wise one. And that was partly because she flies further. So she ended up getting a bigger and bigger role sorting out mistakes that were happening with other characters. But then I also realized Hummingbird is in so many indigenous traditions, stories for bringing the sun and having therefore burnt herself, and that it wasn't just chance perhaps that I had picked a hummingbird, that it's kind of, she had come to me to play this major role. The other thing we wanted to start doing, I'd love to share, and I don't have screen share right now, but I ended up picking like the most non-identifiable or not least body parts creature, a worm, and started telling wormy stories as well. And I'm sorry for the not of creative name, but that was what the kids were calling it, was wormy. So I'm like, okay, wormy. But wormy went on a series of adventures for many weeks. And when I was teaching about animal adaptations, and I ended up bringing in personal narrative for my own amusement, where the magic words that hummingbird would give so wormy could travel were jantar mantar, which is how you say abracadabra in Urdu. My father's from Pakistan. And so I co-opted all these kids into walking around going jantar mantar. But then my story became very personal, right? Because I was just pulling that little piece in that I don't usually talk about. And then sort of thinking about our nature journaling world is, I just talked and I said, there's no illustrations. And the way we got everything into everybody's head was the students illustrated each chapter of the story. How did the worm slowly turn into, I can't remember what species of lizard I picked when it went to the desert so it could actually survive. And I have these like marvelous series of drawings But then they got super imaginative themselves, and there was always Coley coming, and there was always some danger involved, through which I pulled in real predators and prey, and the whole ecosystem, and then they had to flee. And there was always a roly-poly waiting at home for Wormy, who hated to travel, was very unadventurous. And if Wormy forgot to change his body back again, sometimes he was so scared of whatever was trying to eat him that, Coley rescued him. They flew back and totally scared the living daylights out of Roly-Poly, who thought a lizard had arrived or a fish had arrived in the compost bin, this and that. Anyway, that's what I did with stories. That's where we went with it. And it just got bigger and bigger. Like, she started showing up in different grades, and it got to where class would start and kids were like, is there a Wormy story? And there were days where I was like, not today. Creative juice is not flying. And other days it was like, oh, start me off, guys, start me off. Or I'd pull in my weekend hike, and I was like, oh, I saw newts this weekend. How can I just do something with that, or do something with the fact that the rainy season has begun, and I want them to think about that. And how do you think Wormy's feeling, everybody, with the rains that have begun? And they threw in plot twists for me sometimes that way as well.
I feel like being part of your class would be to have a foot in magical realism. Yes.
Which is some of my favorite fiction to read as well, as magical realism. Yeah.
That's
yeah. And then I started, it motivated me to go hear more storytellers myself and watch and see what little strategies are they using. Oh, they made a few sounds along the way. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Everybody had their own style. They changed voices. So then I got braver with fooling around with voices. And it was like a process for me as well, In fact, my boss even was like, what are you doing for professional development this year? And I was like, working on storytelling. And she's like, okay. I was like, could you pay for the cup of tea while I'm listening to this storyteller at the local tea house? So yeah, it was a very fascinating journey, really fascinating.
And
so much more.
It's also interesting the way you're bringing in elements of what is personal and meaningful for you, right? Bringing in parts of Urdu that then bring you back to a connection with childhood and family.
Mm-hmm.
And through the process of doing this, you're also kind of rewriting the story of who you are, and how you relate to the world, and that there's sort of making your identity through, oh, I'm a storyteller.
Mm-hmm.
I have one anecdote on this, and by the way, I want to say to everybody who's watching, see that raise hand function, right, under reactions. If anybody wants to be in on this conversation, we want you in on the conversation. The reason that we have people's, when you come into the meeting, your ability to speak is turned off. So you have to let us know that you've got something to share. That's just to make sure that should any Zoom bombers get in, that they are going to behave. And stuffies are welcome. Yeah, raise your wing.
Raising the wing.
You can use the raise wing function.
Which she did, and she could also cover her eyes if something really freaky happens.
I just want to drop one anecdote in here, and then we're going to see what Kate or Rebecca or anyone else is thinking about this. Actually, I'm going to bring, Rebecca has a hand up. There's been a hand up. I don't know how long, because my screen has been in the wrong place. I'm going to add Rebecca into here, and Rebecca, drop it like it's hot.
Did you want to tell your anecdote first? I have a bunch more to share if there's time, but I do want to let other people share.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Great. So I'll drop this in. I'll try to be sort of fast on it. Sort of thinking about power of story and identity. From a very early age, my two little daughters, in the evening, when it's time to go to bed, they want to snuggle with either mommy or daddy. And so we kind of, crawl into bed there, and there's a little head that then ends up kind of propped on your shoulder. And for a while we had them both in the same bed. So you get in the middle and there'd be a little head here and there'd be a little head here. And what I would do is I would tell them stories. The stories would always start off the same way, that once upon a time, there were two brave and adventurous little girls named Amelia and Carolyn. And they'd be like, is that me? I'm like, I don't know. What do you think? And so they would go on these adventures, and the adventures would inevitably involve sort of interactions with different sorts of animals, relate to things that they had done that day. If there are things that they were being challenging, kind of interpersonal, these little girls would kind of run into those challenges. There would inevitably be animals of some sort in trouble, and they would have to kind of get them out. There'd be some sort of adventure going on. There would be part of the story where they would be packing a bag full of supplies to kind of like, let's go solve this. And there's that, like, one of the sort of a classic scene in movies is like where the hero or heroine is like, putting all the stuff, on, and putting the stuff in the backpack to go out on the adventure. So they would be putting like their snacks and some water and a headlamp and their journal, and they would often journal some point during their adventure. And I'd also say, and of course they packed a rope, because you always need a rope. And so there'd be at some point in the story where you would need the rope to kind of to navigate some challenge that you had. So my daughters then started packing their own Adventure Girl kits. They still have the Adventure Girl kits. They call them their Adventure Girl kits. They regularly throw a rope into it, because you always need a rope. And what we do when we're out, I often am looking for things like, is there any excuse in this environment that we could use a rope to do something with? Like, oh gosh, we could do that, but if only we had a rope. Wait, I've got one. You've got a rope, right? So, but that's kind of, it's this that identity from the story kind of crosses over into that real life. So, I'm done.
Can I just pop in, Rebecca, before you? This reminded me of something. The other storytelling strategy I was using, sometimes keeping it personal, and partly so I could keep track, is I have another sister. And if I needed to talk about something and I wasn't using my puppets, I would have two sisters running around in a garden, planting something, or, they kept confusing the nasturtium seeds with the pea seeds because they weren't really observing, and all that stuff that we were going to then be doing during our seed planting. And the way I kept track and kept it personal was, of course, the younger sister, I'm the older, the younger sister always got it wrong. And the older sister, who only I knew was me, got it right. And I ended up feeling like I had to call up my sister every time I got home after one of those stories and kind of apologize. I'm like, I'm sorry, you were the know nothing. She fortunately did not care.
Oh, that's
So that was a fun way to keep it in personal, a story that had secret personal elements.
Yeah. I had once went on a backpacking trip with Kelly Nelson, who was another educator at the California Academy of Sciences. And we were backpacking with a group of about 15 kids in the Sierra Nevada. And at night, she would tell these stories. And every night, every story was one that she made up on the spot, involved at some point every kid in the group doing something in the story. And she never left somebody out. I don't know how she did it. I had a hard enough time with 2. But yeah, that's those personal stories. We connect with that. Rebecca, and then we're going to be bringing also Susan in on the conversation.
So what you guys are all talking about is, right now I see there are 2 main purposes for stories, and one of them that you guys are talking about is sort of this like stories as priming or as inspiration. Like, I mean, the storytelling itself can be an activity too, like that where you're teaching everything, but it can also be like Aisha was just saying with the kinds of seeds, as you know, instead of just coming in there and saying, all right, class, today we're going to do the activity, here's the instructions, and everybody's like bored and why are we doing this? You know, you're telling the story, that's getting them all really excited. It's like creating this vacuum that they just, now they really want to do it. And so in Coyote's guide, again, it talks about there are 3 levels of stories that you can use for priming. So one of them is things that anybody can do, as this builds the confidence and establishes trust. And they're like, oh yeah, I could do that. Anybody could do that. And then the second level it talks about is stories about things that are right on the edge of their comfort zone. You know, it starts out in their comfort zone. It's like, and then this happened. And it just like stretches the possibility in their imagination of what could be possible for them. And then the third type that it says is once in a while, tell a story that's beyond their edge. That's like a hero story about some kind of like legendary character that just shows these huge possibilities. Like an example it gives is the story of you know, John Muir on the tree in the windstorm, of like these famous naturalists, or it could be mythical characters, like these incredible things. But it warns, you know, to be careful about, you know, don't tell them too often and mix up the characters, or don't tell them who the character is. You know, do you want to avoid hero worship or making things seem too out of reach? You know, you don't want to, if you only tell that kind of story, then it's like, oh, well, then nothing's possible for me to do. So it describes those 3 types of stories. And then where to find the stories, a lot of this has already been touched on. Personal stories of like hero stories, either true or fictional stories from different naturalists through history, or real life ones, or myths, traditional like Native American stories, or myths from your own ancestry, or just stories of the animals or the creatures. You know, how do they survive? How do they navigate their world? And, you know, telling the stories of these animals. So all those kinds of things. So that's all about stories as the way to inspire and, you know, priming for an activity. But there's a second purpose for stories, which I briefly mentioned earlier, and that I think is, you know, when we talk about the power of stories, I think the first thing that we typically think of is, oh, we're the educators. How do we be storytellers? How do we tell the stories to the kids or to whoever? But what I think is just as important, if not even more important, is being somebody who can listen to their stories. I've kind of been calling this, you know, being a story catcher for that person. Because one thing, again, can you tell this is a lot of influence on me, but the author of this book has talked about how in cultures that are really connected to nature, a kid might have like 30 different people who they can go to when they go out to nature and they have an experience, they might have like 30 different people they could talk to share their story of what happened that day. And it doesn't even have to be like, oh, I'm a storyteller, like I'm telling the story now. It could just be the simple kind of like, oh, I got home from school, we're on their dinner table, we're just casually sharing with each other and telling about our experiences and what happened that day. But in our culture, a lot of kids don't really have anybody that they could share the story with, or anybody who's like emotionally available in that kind of way. So, and I think that's a really key part of the process of nature journaling or having an experience in nature, is that to be able to process the experience and to really learn from it, you have to share it, because otherwise you'll just go have an experience and then kind of forget about it. And I think also to have that sense of feeling heard and to get that sense of belonging as part of a group, and then you'll feel more comfortable to share even more. And so how to be a good story catcher or a listener of stories is just simply to listen deeply to the person telling their story, and then be curious and ask good questions about it. Kind of, draw on the observers, like, oh, well, what about that? Tell me, then what happened? Tell me more about this. And the more different people that you tell the story to, different people will be curious about different aspects of the story. And so then you'll process it from, all the different angles. And another thing that it says in Coyote's guide is that the stories that they tell reveal, if you're paying attention, they reveal their growth edges. Where are they comfortable? Where are they not comfortable? What do they need to learn next? You can pay attention to what captured their attention. What did they notice? What didn't they notice? If they're like, oh, I noticed this bird, and you're like, oh, what was it doing? And they're like, oh, I don't know. Then you can be like, oh, well, maybe tomorrow you can go back and then you can tell me, what the bird was doing or whatever. What are they excited to talk about? How do they express themselves? What words do they use? And so, when you talk about growth edges, and yes, the stories can help us to figure out what those are. And I want Susan and other people to go, but I just have one more little topic I want to get in, which is tying back to this idea that stories connect us to the place. I think as Kate was talking about earlier, we all are part of a story, even when we don't realize it. Our ways of thinking and our ways of being are influenced by the cultural story and the societal story, our worldview. But we also get to shape that worldview. All of our little stories that we tell to each other every day, that builds the collective knowledge, and it builds the cultural story. As Ivea said during a personal conversation we had one time, the stories are like the underdrawing of the world that we're creating. And to realize that all of the different creatures and plants and animals are all different characters of the story. It's not just us humans. And this, I think, Jack talks a lot about how our nature journal is our brain on paper. We're externalizing our thoughts onto the land. But I wonder if also our stories get externalized onto the land itself. And, then when we are in a specific place, either culturally or our personal stories, then we're reminded of those stories. And then, we connect to our sense of place. The land is a part of our stories, but then also that we and our stories are part of the land. So those were some more thoughts that I wanted to share.
That really resonates with me. I know that you're talking about sort of the personal landscape that you have. There are places. I was recently in Tuolumne Meadows and taking a path out of it towards the mountains. I came across a bridge where I had stopped with my mother, and we had scooped water with our little tin Sierra Club cups, and drank out of the stream. And it brought me back to sort of being maybe 8 years old and standing there with mom in her striped shirt and her blue hat. And so the landscape that we live in is a personal one. And then when you can you imagine just sort of laying over that, so also the sacred landscape that that some cultures have created around the place where they are, that, you know, that peak right there, that is where Earthmaker stood with Coyote when they, you know, whatever it was. And that big rock over there, that's the basket that was thrown by, you know, whatever it is, that there is embedded in the landscape is not just your own personal experiences of place, but the stories of your culture. That's powerful. I'm going to bring Susan in on this. Susan, thank you so much for being here, and would love to hear your thoughts about this thread of ideas.
Hello, here we go. Rebecca, everything you're saying is like making so many things, sparks flying in my brain. I have so many thoughts, but I'm going to try and narrow it down to just one thing. Something that I was thinking about with regard to education, and I will say that I've only been attending this session a couple of times, but I've watched a few of the YouTube sessions, the previous ones, and give me so many ideas and so many thoughts of how I can improve my skills as an educator and how I can think about how to do these things better. It's great. But one thing I've mentioned a few times is that I'm a math teacher. I teach math at the college level, and mostly calculus, which is sort of what passes for more or less our intro math class for a lot of students. I know calculus sounds really scary, but that's sort of the context. So I'm not teaching nature journaling, and to be honest, I feel like nature journaling and art tend to be things that are sort of, students are kind of a bit at least self-selected for like people being interested in it and wanting to learn it. I realize that's not necessarily the case always, and obviously many of you guys who do a lot of nature journal teaching do have students who aren't interested and aren't engaged. I do feel like for math, this question of students being interested in learning it and willing to learn it and feeling brave enough to try it is really, really, really challenging. The vast majority of the students who come into my class are students who are not confident in math. They aren't interested in math. Their goal is to get this thing out of the way and have a mark on their transcript as fast as possible so they can go on to do whatever other thing they're interested in doing. So it can be a little demoralizing. But one thing that I really that I'm thinking about, that I'm really, really trying to improve in my teaching of this, is thinking about how I can connect with them. And one of the big things is that the problem I always say with math teachers is that we're mathematicians. And mathematicians are self-selected for, we are the people who like to think very abstractly and very hypothetically, and we sort of pare down all the details that we don't need. So I don't have to think about 3 apples, I could just think about the number 3. Or I can think about the number X without knowing what that number is. And we can do all these things, and the more abstract you can go, the easier time you're going to have with math. And mathematicians are generally, we're the ones who are like stripping everything of all of those like personal aspects of things, which most students and most people, that is the opposite of what makes sense to them, what they're interested in, what they have any motivation to learn. So my job is to kind of like just to figure out how to help students to learn to think more abstractly and be more comfortable with it, because it really does have advantages. It really can help you to use the tools of mathematics, but also, you know, but also to be able to take those abstract things and for me to kind of turn that into something that's less abstract that students can get a better grasp on. And the story angle here, I think there's sort of two ways that I'm trying to use stories to help with that. One is, I feel like we do a lot of teaching of calculus and any other math topic, it's sort of in a vacuum. It's like, okay, well, you know, the derivative of this thing is this, and this is how you do it. And now solve these 30 derivative problems on this page. Okay, now here's how to solve the integral and do this thing and also these problems. But every single one of these mathematical tools was invented by somebody. In fact, it was invented by lots of people over the course of several hundred years, all figuring out new ways to do these things and improving the tools that we have to do it. So on the one hand, there's this idea that like, I can give you all these sort of pure mathematical facts that exist in a vacuum. But the fact is that every single one of those things has a reason why it works that way. And there's a reason why we developed that particular technique to solve the problem. And so if I can, as much as possible, I try to, whenever I can, not just tell students, okay, this is how you solve this problem, but let's think about it together. Let's work it out. Let's figure out how to put together what we know. And really, even though I'm not like telling a story with beginning, middle, and end, we kind of are, because I'm kind of saying, okay, here's all these things we don't know. Let's try some things, let's figure it out. And then once we've actually figured out how to solve the problem, we go back and look at it and say, okay, what was it that worked? Can we figure out how to apply that in a new situation? And I really think there's a sort of a narrative to that. And there was one time in all the years I've been teaching this, one time we were going through this one particular problem and we're talking about it and we're kind of making a few points here, and I drew this new, and I was just drawing, I said, look, here's this diagram. Let's make a bigger version of it so we can see it better. I make a bigger version. And while I'm drawing on the board, I hear behind me, and I've treasured that moment. That is like the most beautiful sound I have ever heard. It happened one time. You know, sometimes they get it without saying that so perfectly, but it was great. So I'm really like, you know, and honestly, like at the end of the day, that's what a mathematician is doing, because I'm not just solving calculus problems all day. I'm proving new pieces of knowledge, using logic to prove new things. And the process of getting there is a lot less direct than the way that I write it down at the end, but I really am telling a story. And really every proof that in a mathematical paper, there is a narrative there. And the proofs that are the easiest to understand are the ones where the author, even though they were doing this very complex high-level mathematical writing, you can tell they were thinking about it as a narrative and they were explaining it in a way that made narrative sense. So I really think, like, even though math seems so far from this kind of like, you know, the humanities and, you know, storytelling and stuff, it's that storytelling thing is still there, and that's how we understand things, even for mathematician. And then the other aspect of this that I'll get to is that I think about, you know, when I'm teaching all these students these calculus things, I figure if you're going to go further in mathematics, you need to know the lore of the field of mathematics. Like, math is full of all these theorems and all these facts about numbers and spaces and vector spaces and calculus and derivatives and all that stuff. But there's people that are behind it. There's very famous mathematicians, there are less famous mathematicians, there are mathematicians about whom stories are told, and there are some really good stories, some really funny stories. A lot of these like really big deal theorems that we will talk about, there's a story behind them. And so what I'm trying really hard to, and I figure, like, by the time if you get further into math and you, like, you know, say our math majors, for instance, by the time you graduate, you should know what those stories are, because that's part of your heritage as a mathematician. You know, I mean, honestly, everybody should know those stories, but like the mathematicians should know for sure. So I'll tell the story. So whenever I'm teaching calculus, we'll talk about this, you know, that we'll get into this one subject involving polynomials. Don't worry about what that is, but I'll tell them a story of how you know how to solve this kind of equation, and you know how to solve this kind of equation. And it turns out there's a way to solve this kind of equation, but it's really complicated and people figure out how to do it. And then this kind of equation, the next logical step, nobody could figure out how to do for hundreds of years. People kept trying and nobody could figure out how to do it. And finally, a very young mathematician who was in his 20s, Évariste Galois, managed to prove that it's impossible to solve this kind of equation. And nobody paid any attention to him. He tried to publish these things. He wrote to Cauchy, who was one of the really famous mathematicians in France at the time, who was in France, who just kind of ignored and dismissed his work, and it wasn't interesting. And then, but Galois proved that you cannot, no matter how hard you try, you can't solve this kind of equation. And but he was also kind of a young hothead revolutionary, and he got challenged to a duel, or I think he got challenged to a duel. I'm not sure if he challenged somebody, that it was going to take place the next morning. I said, oh no, what if I die in this duel and nobody ever knows my work because I didn't write it down properly? So he stayed up all night, like writing up and like organizing and indexing and things, all the research that he'd been working on, so it was all as easy to follow as possible, all these ideas he had. Stayed up all night organizing these things, went to the duel, got killed in the duel. But because he had done all this work to organize all his work and like that work did eventually come to Cauchy, who had earlier had dismissed him, and Cauchy was like a big deal, but he was like one of the people who really codified calculus into like the sort of usable field of math that we have now, and did actually end up kind of recognizing his genius and contributing further to the field of Galois theory that Galois invented. But I tell my students, you see, the lesson though here is that you shouldn't pull all-nighters, because maybe if he hadn't stayed up all night, maybe he wouldn't have died in that duel. So, which always gets a laugh. And so I figure, like, this is like, it's a good story. You should know that story if you're gonna, be a mathematician. You should know the lore. There's all these stories that mathematicians share. There's the story about the interesting number. If you tell a mathematician, I'm thinking of an interesting number, they're gonna know what number you're thinking of. But at this, but it makes them laugh. It kind of humanizes this, and it's a little side note, and it shows that it's a little side story that we don't have to always just be focused on solving these equations. Sometimes there are equations you can't solve, and we can prove it. But so what Rebecca, what you were saying about telling stories about sort of ordinary everyday things and things that are kind of at the limits, and then a few stories about great heroes, is making me think, because I'm thinking like a lot of the stories that I'll commonly tell in my calculus classes are about the great men of mathematics, and unfortunately there are not that many stories about women, or for that matter anybody who isn't European, that I'm able to bring into this. So I need to like work on that. But it's making me also think that like maybe I need to reconsider or find new stories to tell, or spend more time listening to students tell stories, because I don't want all the stories to be just about these great men who were geniuses, and you're not a genius, so I guess you won't be able to do it. I want students to feel confident. So it's interesting. I think that's probably in every field. Physics has got all kinds of lore and stories about how people discovered these amazing discoveries. Biology, everything, any field that you study, there's got to be stories about the people who were in that field and the interesting things they did, and there it is.
That is so useful. You're helping us sort of see how the story makes this information relevant, and personal, instead of just numbers that are sitting out there. This is all about ideas and people disagreeing with each other, and there's even drama there.
Let me tell you about this. I'm not going to tell you the story, but the essay by Bishop Berkeley railing against Isaac Newton and this newfangled calculus that he'd invented, and how it's complete nonsense, and it's all correct. This essay is like, yeah. Anyway, speaking of drama,
I mean that's great. That's great, because but also it shows that this is thinking, and this is a human endeavor. I think one area that this also really applies to is the history of science. You can look at, say, our understanding of our place in the cosmos. as a beautiful example of storytelling. Like, we were thinking this, and then this Greek figured out this, and ooh, it's round, and how big it is, and that then, like, oh, we're in the center, and then somebody, oh, you're not in the center, and here's why. And so the history of our sort of changing place in the cosmos, when told through the discoveries of people, or even, you know, the drama of Galileo being being threatened for discoveries, you know, that is, I mean, that's great storytelling. And you're also sort of seeing how kind of science changes over time by we're looking at the world, and we're kind of we're not quite right, but we're getting closer to something that is right. And we're still in that process. That helps you understand the process of science.
The same process we're using in their nature journaling, and, you know, like, I think this is true, but let me investigate some more. Maybe that was wrong, but, you know, it was worth putting it down because I wouldn't have investigated so much if I hadn't written it down.
Yeah. Oh, and I think a fun woman who you can include in your in the maths stories, because she's somebody who used visualization and pictures to help understand math concepts, is Miriam Mirkazani, Iranian mathematician who got the Fields Medal, right? I mean, which is like the go do a dance medal for mathematicians. But a lot of her research was done through kind of just drawing little topological doodles. And I mean, for us visual thinkers, there's a great story in that as well. I wanted to share just one other thought that you got me thinking about, was that the way that the story can reinforce your identity about who you are. And, you know, for instance, if you're telling these stories about the mathematicians sort of disagreeing with each other and sort of thinking these sorts of things, and that, you know, like, it's fun to imagine yourself as one of those people. And the more you kind of identify yourself as a mathematician, the more you sort of identify yourself sort of in this story of battling ideas and puzzle making. So that got me thinking about one other thing. I'm going to bounce over to a journal page here, and let's see, why are you not letting me share there we go.
Aisha's also got her hand up too.
Oh, great. I'll be there in just a second. So here's just a little bit about sort of storytelling in journals. So for a long time, the way that I would tell stories in journals is just like, I observed this flatworm doing something cool, and it ate a slug. And here's, you know, first it did this, and then it did this, and then it did this, and then it came back later, and this is what happened. And you did not want to be that slug, right? Bad day for a slug, good day for the flatworm. So that's a form of sort of sequential storytelling, essentially making a comic book. But I just wanted to point out two other little kind of stories in this journal here. This is just, I went into this. Carolyn discovered that if you dip your fingers in bananas, tropical butterflies will sit on your fingertips and lick your fingers. And that's what she's up to right here. And so this is a little sketch of Carolyn with butterflies on her hands and one on her hat that is from a real moment that she had. And because I drew a little cartoon of her in my sketchbook doing this, this story remains with us and then is more deeply embedded into part of her identity. So when you are, as Rebecca was saying, a story catcher, you can catch a story for somebody, you are helping them embed that story in their personal narrative of who they are and their life. If it doesn't turn into a story, we just forget it. One other story that I wanted to show you is, this is a little hummingbird that was caught in a corner of a room in Ecuador. And it had probably been there for a day or maybe two, and was hypoglycemic and on the edge of death. Just, it could not hold its head up, it would flop over. It was all fluffed out. And Amelia found it and got a thimbleful of sugar water and put that under its beak, held it in her little hand, and it started to drink with a tongue coming out. And then it started to bring its feathers back in, and its eyes opened a little bit, and then even more, and then it pooped on her hand twice, right? And then started looking around, and as she sat there, it opened its wings and flew away. So that story, by capturing the story in my journal, helps Amelia incorporate that story into the narrative that is her life. Because there's all these experiences that happen to us. They don't turn into a story, they get lost. But if you can capture it as a story, then it becomes part of your identity and who you are. And so by selectively choosing which stories we want to remember, the ones that make us stronger, the ones that bring us closer to who we want to be, we are able to build our identities and grow through stories. So I thought that was perhaps an interesting idea of kind of combining story and here with visual storytelling. But this is capturing a story. Not just that, here's a bird, but the story is really what is so powerful there. And that changes her idea of who she is and how she walks in the world. I am going over to the gallery to see if there's anybody else who had a thought, a comment, or idea that they wanted to share with the community. You can either use the raise hand function. I'm going to bring Ivea in on this conversation. Hey there.
Hey there. I think Aisha was raising her hand, so I was going to let her.
Oh, great. Yes. Oh, you're absolutely right.
And then after she goes, I had a poem to share if there's time.
Oh, fantastic.
Jack's story just reminded me of when I added myself into a nature journaling page at Tomales Bay, my feet. Then I put down that my friend was painting right next to me. And it changed how much I loved that page because it brought both of us in there, and the tide was coming up and about to float away all our nature journaling materials. And so that was, I think, starting to fool with that. But really the reason I raised my hand was still thinking about the whole identity piece and wanted to share something just super personal that just happened to me last few months. Well, just about a month ago, my father passed away, and I was in Pakistan for a few weeks, and obviously it was very difficult, but also very difficult for my identity because it's a culture I've kind of pushed away. It's just been too difficult to manage my white American side and my Paisnai side. So a lot of complicated feelings. And I got there and it was just this immersion in the culture there and a very urban place. And only garden access I had to was a few potted plants on the roof of a cousin. And finally, about a week into it, I was like able to pull myself together enough, and I had taken some blank paper with me and I actually sat down and nature journaled. And what was so special about that was it helped me grab on to this, my own identity, the way I saw myself as a naturalist, which I had just lost completely, like it was gone. And I just felt like I was losing myself along with losing a parent. It was just like, who am I? What is this? And so I just wanted to share, like, nature journaling helped me change my narrative that day. And I started off the whole day so much more grounded, like, yeah, I'm still in there and I'm going to get back to myself once I get back to the US. And the next day I managed to journal one more time and it was the same. Like, can I change the narrative of who I am by nature journaling? And I did the same thing when my mom was in the hospital a few months ago and she's fine. But I had a day where I just journaled while I waited for the surgery. Because again, when you're in hospitals and stuff, you're so out of yourself and your element. And it was a way to kind of almost like shift the narrative. I want to just kind of keep coming back to that word. The narrative and identity we've been talking about, and kind of turn it around on its head. And there's another way we can use it. So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. That's beautiful.
Yeah, it saved me. And it kind of saved me because I've been coming so much here to this group. And so nature journaling is way more on my forefront as a tool.
Yeah.
For myself, not just, of course, to teach it, but for myself. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah. When my mother died, with I sat by her bedside and drew her after she died, and my brother found that morbid and grotesque, but for me it was, and then I sort of just I wrote for a while about what was going on, but that was my way of actually being there in that moment. Yeah. Thank you. Billy Joe?
I just reminded me of a different way of looking at it as well when we're talking about our identity and being in those moments and being able to grasp them onto our nature journal and finding who we are. I think there's a power in storytelling to also let others see us the way that we want to be seen as well, if that makes any sense. So sometimes when you're an educator, you're looked at as somebody who doesn't actually have a life. Like, remember when you seen your teacher like in the grocery store and you were like, you go to the grocery store? Like, there's this sort of very strange feeling like you have kids. Like, it's really interesting. And I always find that whenever I'm teaching, if there's an opportunity to give a story that happened to me personally that relates to what is happening, and if it's a bit of a funny story or it's a funny situation, it almost makes me human and it allows me on a different level with the students. And not that I'm become personally involved, but it's like, oh, she's human, she's just like me, she's got fears, she's got funny things that have happened to her, and she's not superhuman, she's just like me. And so that is one of the things that I really like about storytelling is being able to sort of humanize the person who's telling the story as well, especially if it's something personal. I won't tell the whole story, but I do sound sometimes with kids, and we talk about how sound can be very imaginative. And if we're in the forest, we always think like the chipmunk is the grizzly bear who's coming to eat us and this whole thing. And I tell a very funny story of me as a canoe trip guide having one of these moments and, finding out, in the end, it was the tarp in the wind, and them laughing hysterically, being like, oh, even though this is her profession, this is what she does, she also had that moment of thinking, there's a bear outside the tent, and what are you going to do? And, that whole thing. And it's just this really great way, and especially if you see those kids again and again and again, they sort of remember those stories, and then you can sort of add to that humanity that is in that as well, which is something I just wanted to add in. And it reminded me of that when the two of you were speaking about the experience that you had with loss of your parents. And I just think it's humanity really is this beautiful storytelling piece.
Yes. Those pesky tarps doing their bear imitations.
And it's one of those things that I think the more you tell those anecdotal stories, even though I probably could search somewhere, and I probably have a written journal somewhere about that experience, the more you tell those, they become embedded as part of who you are. And going back to what Rebecca said, the more you share and tell those stories, when you go back to those places that it happened, it's almost like you can imagine and see those stories, like she was saying, on the land. I spent a lot of my youth in Algonquin Park.
This is where it happened. This is the tarp spot.
Yeah, exactly. Like I go back to Algonquin Park, which is one of our biggest Ontario provincial parks, and I spent a lot of my youth there. And I take my family back now, and I say, this is where I seen the bear, or this is where, we broke the rules and we went swimming after dark, or this is where I seen this, or this is where I did this. And it's like, as soon as I drive into that road, those stories from 20 years ago just start to reimagine all over the landscape. And it's amazing. Like, when Rebecca said that, I was like, yes, I know that, I feel that, and I can tell when those moments are happening. And now I get to just add to those with stories from my own family being added into that place and that land. And I think that connection to place is really amazing with the power of story.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you so much, Billy Joe. Evea, will you take us out? I'd love to hear your thoughts, comments, and ideas. Also mention to people about restoration. Actually, we're going to bring in Rebecca, and then we're going to end with, and so first, any thoughts and ideas that you have, Evea, then Rebecca's got some comments and ideas, and then we're going to, also I want to see if Kate wanted to add anything, and then we're going to end with a poem. So that is our plan so that people can get to their lunch.
Let's just go right to Rebecca and Kate. I want to hear what they have to say. Okay.
And I want to hear Evea's poem, but I just wanted to leave everybody with a little homework assignment. Maybe I shouldn't call it homework, but a little invitation to an adventure, I guess. We were talking about, I would like to invite everybody, maybe over the next week, to think about what are some anecdotes or some stories that you would like to share. Maybe it's something that's from your nature journal that you maybe haven't thought of as a story, but there is a story behind that observation or that moment. That's something meaningful, and why is it meaningful to you, and where did it happen, and or maybe it's something that's in your memory that you haven't put in your nature journal. And is there somebody who you can tell it to, who is who you'd feel comfortable to tell it to in your everyday life, maybe to your students, or maybe to a family member or a neighbor or a friend. And and it doesn't have to be as like a performance, like you're on stage, but just telling the story just as a part of being human. And like what Aisha was saying, we can learn from professional storytellers and we can pick up tricks and techniques, but we all have a story to tell. We all have our voice to share. just as we are right now already. And so, yeah, can you find a story, or kind of start to build this collection or this repertoire of stories that are part of your personal narrative? And can you find somebody to share it with, just informally, as part of being human? And then maybe you can ask the other person to share a story with you too.
We're going to make that our practice this week around the dinner table. Though I'm going to try to get the whole family in on your project. That's brilliant. Kate, any thoughts or comments that you would like to share?
I guess I just wanted to share, like, I just love everything that people have shared. There's so many things to consider. One of the things that we're really taught is like letting, as we have our own personal narratives for the land, is like also, listening always to the land and letting the land change us. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you so much. Rebecca and Kate, I'm so grateful to you for being here, sharing your thoughts, inspirations, and ideas. I'd like to also thank the whole community for your participation in this. And my co-hosts, Ivea and Billy Joe, really grateful to you for helping facilitate and curate the conversations in this community. Ivea, you've got a poem for us.
Yeah, okay, here we go. It's been a really long time since I've said this poem, so if I stumble a little, I apologize, but here goes. This poem is called Tell Them Stories. Tell them stories, I say, and they will laugh. Tell them stories, I say, and they will cry. They will wonder, they will love, they will cherish, they will dream, they will falter, they will despair. Tell them stories, and they will wish it had been different for the lead person. Tell them stories, and they will want to cry out at every welling of emotion aging them. Tell them stories, and they will have confidence. Tell them stories, and they will understand. Tell them stories, and they will learn. Tell them stories. Thank you.
Ivea, that was one that you've committed to memory. Thank you so much for sharing that with us, and for all that you share with this community. I think that's a wonderful call to action.
Thank you.
We can turn this. I think that's a beautiful way to end our discussion here. So grateful to you, to this blessed community, for all your thoughts, kindness, ideas, generosity of thought. Do you know who the author of the poem is?
I wrote it when I was 15.
It's you.
Yeah. Been a really long time since I've said that poem out loud. Thanks for listening.
Would you be willing to write that down on a piece of paper and send it to me? Absolutely. I would love to paste that into my journal.
I would be honored. I absolutely will. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all, dear friends. Be safe, be kind, be the best that we can be. And this is how we change. And we get to decide how we change and to what. So thank you all for this time of deep reflection. Really grateful to all of you. Be well.
Thank you, everybody.